Today, the second part of my discussion on narratology. Although the basis of this narratological discussion is Seymour Chapman's work and the primary text that I have selected for the study, James Joyce's Araby and Eveline. I shall be focusing on different ways, different narrative strategies that are involved in the reading of the text. How narratology uses these different narrative strategies to study the text. Number one, as Janet has pointed out, there can be three types of narrators. Narrators who are involved in narrating the story. In the last discussion, we have seen how the story and the discourse, they differ. How the content, the history, in a chronological manner, within the time, within a space, operates within a broader framework of the discourse or the plot or the narrative. So we have the role of the narrator. A homodiegetic narrator is one who is present in the story and gives you a first-hand information regarding the progression of the story. So there are two time frames, one related to the content, that means related to the story, or we can say the storyline that takes place in a particular time, involves a sequence of action closely interrelated with cause and effect relationship, and operates within that specific time and space. All the heterotopical spaces, means multiple spaces can be there, along with multiple time frames can be there in the story. The story involves certain characters. Homodiegetic narrator is a person who is present in that story and has the first-hand knowledge about the events, characters, setting, and keeps on narrating us like a commentator. This homodiegetic narrator can also become a participant narrator who is a part and parcel of the story, can even become a subject, a character in the story, involved in action within that same specified time framework. So homodiegetic narrator and autodiegetic narrator. Autodiegetic narrator is an autobiographical character who is present, who is narrating his or her own story within the framework. The second type of narration is that of heterodiegetic narrator. Heterodiegetic narrator has been a common type of narrator, usually the authorial narrator, who is present throughout the story, but not from within, but from outside. This location of this narrator who is telling the story through a discourse with a sense of omniscience, omnipresence, a person who knows whatever is going to happen, what has happened, what is happening, as well as can take recourse into the psychology of the characters. So this all-knowing, all-pervasive type of narrator is called heterodiegetic narrator. In case of both homodiegetic narrator or heterodiegetic narrator, we always find that in the discourse, in the narration, we have focus on the subject or the setting or the event. And this is done through a systematic, strategic focalization. Even in case of cinema, where the visual narrative is used, we have this type of focalization. The lens of camera can go for zoom in and zoom out, wide angle, or can go for a close-up in order to focalize on the subject. And this is also supported by the narration. In some visual narratives, we have the presence of heterodiegetic narrator narrating what is happening. In some cases, the homodiegetic narrator gives an eyewitness account of what is happening. And in some cases, we also have the first person narrator, who is also a participant, through whose eyes or through whose lens of camera we see the subject. So these three ways can be seen in narrative. So narratology analyzes the use of homodiegetic narrator, heterodiegetic narrator, and focalization. And these three concepts were introduced by Gerard Genette. To study Araby and Eveline, we are also to focus on Seymour Chapman's concept of overtness and covertness. I talked about this in my last lecture, where we have a type of narration that speaks to the audience directly, telling the audience almost everything, what is happening in the story. There is also the presence of a covertness in this narrative act, where things are suggested instead of narrated. Things are hinted at instead of described. So this covertness is present where we have the readers as participant in the act of narration, consciously filling in the gaps in between the narrative hints. So when the story is there, we are seeing the story through the eyes of the narrator, either homodiegetic or autodiegetic or heterodiegetic. We are within a frame of narrative time. That narrative time is very important. So we are to deal with two segments of time. One, the story time. The second is the narration time. If you kindly remember the narrative structure of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, you will find that the story is a long one, but the narration that is being taken up is within a time frame. And that Marlowe, as the narrator, narrates the story within that time frame. So that is called the narrative time. Say 24 hours, or say 6 hours, or just 3 hours. Whatever time is taken by the narrator to narrate the story is called the narrative time. While the entire story that is being narrated, that takes into account the stories of past, the stories of far past, historical past, story of recent past, as well as the story that is being narrated within the present. So pastness of the story is brought into the present time framework through the act of narration. And we have the interplay of these two times. Say, once upon a time, there was a king, there was a queen. The king went to war. The king died. The queen also died. The story ends. So the story must have taken place, say, within a time framework of 30 years, 40 years. The story is there at the core. We can say that this is a proto-story. But this proto-story has to be converted into the narration of the story through a plot framework. Therefore, when the story is to be narrated using a plot framework, there has to be a beginning, a middle, and an end, according to Aristotle. So beginning is the place where the story begins. So it has a past, but it takes you directly into the thick of the action, thereby leading to the consequent action tied together with cause and effect relationship or causal logic. Therefore, the middle is caused by the beginning, while the middle will be leading to the end. whereby all the threads will be woven together and brought to a climactic, catastrophic, conclusive, inconclusive ending. So here we have the voice. Now, Lanzer talked about the act of narration as a transmission of a voice. Whose voice are we listening to? So when homodiegetic narrator or heterodiegetic narrator or the autodiegetic narrator is narrating the story, we can easily identify that this is the voice of the narrator. In some cases, we say that the homodiegetic narrator is the authorial voice. That means the author is directly communicating to the readers, as we find in the works of Charles Dickens or, say, Jane Austen, where we have direct communication between the author who takes the omniscience voice of a third person narrator and recounts or tells you the story within a narrative time framework. Even in that case, we have the voice that is identifiable. In most of the novels of Dickens, we have a same voice narrating the story, apart from the first person narratorial autobiographical novels. We have the voice of the author narrator, omniscient narrator, homodiegetic narrator, conveying you the story. So story is the message, narrative is the vehicle. So how the story is to be transported through the vehicle of narrative to the audience. And in this vehicle is contained the message. Message is the story or the history. So we have to identify the voice who is telling the story. Mikhail Bakhtin talked about the multiplicity of voice. So it is not saturated, it is not monophonic, monologic. Rather, as a genre, according to Bakhtin, novel is a discourse that is dialogic. A dialogic discourse involves the presence of multiplicity of voices. So multiple voices are there in narrative. Such voices are usually identified by the narrator, either the homodiegetic narrator or heterodiegetic narrator, and communicated again through the vehicle of narrative to the readers. So this vehicle might contain inset narratives, comments, observations, dialogues, inset in the broader framework of the work. So there are human limitations, of course, in the act of narration. Whether it is homodiegetic narrator, heterodiegetic narrator, or autodiegetic narrator, we find that there are limitations. I was referring to James Joyce, who in his Stephen Hero writes about the impossibility of narrating the story of childhood, adolescence, in a story that is composed by an author who has already resolved that phase of adolescence and has matured through a process of growing up. So even in such Bildu Roma, stream of consciousness novel, we have this limitation of the voice, limitation of the narrator to narrate the story or experience. James Joyce says that the memories of childhood are stored, and as we grow up, these stories take a shape of resolved stories that are duly framed in iron memorial framework. So this iron memorial framework tries to retain the authenticity of the story. Say the Araby in Araby, the boy who has undergone a series of crises in his pre-adolescence days was unable to understand things. Even this is seen in a portrait of the artist as a young man, where we have Stephen Dedalus unable to understand so many things when he is a small child. As that story captures even the mind of a small boy who is being threatened by the oppressive adult voices. Apologize, apologize, eagles will pull out your eyes. So that baby Tuku, who can just say cuckoo, cuckoo, is aware of these voices that are recurring. So these threatening voices recur in his mind. But as this boy grows up, the boy has already resolved such voices, voices that had repressed him, or voices that have regulated his life, disciplined through punishment, his inner voices. But such voices are now regulated through a process of socialization. And when the adult narrator is trying to narrate these stories, this narrator has to depend on either the autobiographical documentations of childhood memories and then retain those in the narrative framework. But even while doing that, there is the human limitation of the narrator to narrate things. So this is partially resolved by the omniscience of the narrator, omniscient narrator. Virginia Woolf talks about this omniscience as patriarchal omniscience. So most of the books that are kept in this library are written on the subject women, and wherever they wrote, the male writers, they wrote it wrongly. So this is the male omniscience that is looking at the lives of the female. Once again, we find the limitations. The mind of the omniscient narrator is not androgynous, according to Virginia Woolf. So such limitations are there. Although the narrator claims to be all-knowing, the narrator has his or her own limitations and has to be almost like God in case of heterodidactic narrator, with omniscience, omnipresence, and yet is challenged by the limitations of knowledge. So the message that is communicated through the vehicle itself is having some kind of limitations. So this is an area of study that the narratology always take into account, whether the story that is being told is convincing. In some cases, we have the narrators preoccupied with this impossibility of the act of narrating the real story or communicating the message to the audience. Thereby, meta-fictional questions are raised within the narrative itself. Whether my narrative is making any meaning or sense, whether the narrative is able to communicate the real story, or whether the narratorial mediation is actually corrupting the story. The truth of the story, as Plato has suggested, cannot be communicated because the narrator, through a discourse that is diegetic, is removed from the reality and is simply making a copy of a copy without understanding the real source of light, chasing the shadows that are there. So representation of such shadows by the narrator through the act of narration will always communicate a false story. Therefore, this has been resolved through verisimilitude, through point of view, through a complex viewpoint, through heteroglossia, through the emplotment of multiple narratives, through a language that has centripetal as well as centrifugal forces to communicate the thought. Narrative situation is very important. So in case of heterodiegetic narration, this narrative situation is not clearly stated. But in case of homodiegetic narration, this narrative situation is overt. So you can see the narrator narrating the story to you. The omniscient narrator, invisible narrator, in case of heterodiegetic narration, hides behind and does not reveal the narrative situation, thereby communicating directly to the audience. An audience definitely has to suspend a sense of disbelief to believe in the tales told by the narrator, like the Thakuma in Thakuma Jhuli. So at the end of every narrative, there is the reminder to the young listeners that my story has ended. Whatever the story was, suspend your sense of disbelief and try to believe in the story. But there we can see the narrator, first person narrator, who is narrating the story and revealing the narrative situation. Like the story of Marlowe, as revealed by the primary narrator in Heart of Darkness. As we can see the narrator, we can see the narrative situation. The authorial interference in the act of narration is minimized. And the limitations of the narrator is overtly stated. Therefore, Marlowe has his own limitations. He does not know the truth. And the entire journey upstream the Congo of the participant narrator, Marlowe, is therefore to travel through the innermost recesses of the human mind, innermost recesses of the Africa, the wilderness of Africa, that is presented in the work, and finally into the mind of the agent who is placed in the inner station, named Codes. So in order to understand who Codes is, Marlowe must take into account, like a detective, the views of other persons. And when such views come from different sources and are contradictory in nature, the narrator cannot resolve or cannot come to an agreement. So in F. Scott Fitzgerald's work, Great Gatsby, we have this Nick Carraway confessing to the audience about the limitations of the narrator, who is located in the narrative situation, revealing the overtness of the narration, while also confessing to the audience that his narration is not going to be the true narration because he is depending on sources. Some sources may or may not be reliable. Some sources might create some situations that will make even the narrative problematic. See, the stories that revolve around J. Gatsby in Fitzgerald's novel belong to the unreal, surreal, real, natural, even impressionistic ranges, with so many ways of finding out the story of Gatsby. The detection of the story becomes more important, and the narrative situation involves mainly the detection of the story more than the telling of the story. I remember Doris Lessing's famous work, Golden Notebook, where we have the narrator maintaining different notebooks, segregating different parts of her life. If Doris Lessing is a writer, she has created a narrator. This narrator is maintaining four notebooks, dividing Annabel's life into four compartments, each compartment revealing or recording in the first person her situation, as a single woman, her situation as an author, her situation as a person trying to survive amid economic challenges, her identity as a person involved in politics, activism, dividing her in four colored notebooks. Inside that notebook that has kept the record of the author's self, we have another inset narrative, almost an autobiographical narrative, a story that is being maintained, where there is another character, a fictional character, who is involved in the story based on the life of that character who is maintaining that notebook. And towards the final section, we have the golden notebook, a 20,000 word text where these separate identities of the same person collapses, diffuses, deforms, dissipates in order to bring together all the identities into a single human identity. And this notebook is called the golden notebook. So this 20,000 word golden notebook is the real story that is to be communicated to the audience. And the author is laying bare the entire narrative situation, revealing even the sources of the narrative, the materials that are used in the narrative, in order to arrive at a particular message to be communicated to the audience. So 800 words, 800 pages novel contains, say, a story of 60 pages. The message that is there in 60 pages. And what has gone into the making of those 60 pages is revealed in those notebooks interspersed in the novel. All the four notebooks are there, kept in the novel. Thus, we have a strange structure, combining the inset narrative structure along with the overall structure that is there in the novel. A reader is throughout engaged in the search of the message, even the search of the textual narrator in a text. So Stanzel talks about this authorial, figural, reflector narrator. And according to Ball, this is a focalizer who is drawing our attention, the attention of the readers to the message. A reader who is primarily engaged in search of a textual narrator in a text always becomes a part of the message, because it involves, along with the narrator, the task of decoding the story. The reader gets some lines of print, and of course the blank spaces in between, the silences in between the narration. The author communicates with the readers through the medium of print. So this typeset narrator story that we usually read focalizes on certain aspects. So in stylistics, we have learned what foregrounding is. So the narrator, this typeset narrator story is foregrounded to the readers, and the readers try to decode the message that is contained therein. Say, for example, in James Joyce's Stories of the Dubliners, we have a title. The titles like Araby, Eveline appear on the top, and then we have the opening printed lines. Take, for example, the first paragraph of Araby. In the first paragraph of Araby, we have directly the setting where we have the voice of a narrator performing a speech act, that maintains an omniscience. So we have a voice in the opening page, in the opening paragraph, the voice of omniscience, the voice of an impersonal third person describing North Richmond Street. This description of the North Richmond Street in the indirect mode, however, soon culminates in the personal and confessional first person mode of narration, as we soon find the boy narrator gradually getting intensely absorbed in the narrative action. So from we, the voice of we come to the voice of I, the first person narrator, in the next section of the work. So this narrator concentrates on a few particulars after giving us a panoramic view of everything perceptible. So in the first paragraph, we have a panoramic view of this North Richmond Street that comprises of two rows of houses and a blind alley. At the end of that street, there is a house, the house of the priest. The narrative focus converts objects into signs, and the boy is there standing, trying to interpret the signs. The sign, the semiotic of landscape, is being interpreted by the narrator who is standing there. So if the first paragraph is the voice of the omniscient narrator giving a panoramic view of the entire narrative situation, placing the boy in the context of the story, the boy is then given a space to narrate his story in the first person. The narrator concentrates on a few particulars and tries to convert at least the objects into signs. So the brown, imperturbable faces of the houses gazing at each other with brown, indifferent faces, such is a description. So the object is converted into sign, and the boy is trying to interpret the sign. Throughout the story, we have this boy trying to interpret the signs, and the narrative is about the interpretation of sign by the homodiegetic narrator, by the autodiegetic narrator. So this homodiegetic narrator is telling you about the sign. The autodiegetic narrator is involved in the reading of the sign, and the heterodiegetic narrator, that is located outside the text, that means the writer, is telling you how this first person narrator, how this autodiegetic or homodiegetic narrator is trying to come in terms with his situation. So Araby, the story, I must say, is about signs, about the sign and their significance, about the symbols and their significance in the life of a boy. Say a typical blind alley, the North Richmond Street, is described as a quiet street. As a quiet street. A street, as we have seen in Eliot's poem, has a soul of its own. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread against the sky. So the narrator, Prufrock, is inviting the street to accompany him in his lonely walk on the street through London. Here again we have the presence of a street that is described as quiet. So this street is quiet because there is no noise, and these noises are to be produced by human agents because it's an urban landscape, either mechanical sounds of the machines or the noises produced by people. So this is described as a quiet street. The auditory image of silence is juxtaposed with an antithetical noisy children who are liberated from the Christian Brothers school in the afternoon. So confinement of the children in the school, the absence of sound, noise, liberation of the sound, liberation of the children all together in this street. The setting with two rows of houses gazing at each other with brown, imperturbable faces also represent not about the houses, but about how the boy who is lonely standing on the street is interpreting his loneliness in terms of the absence of human agents in the houses. Therefore, the factual description is carefully and gradually modified, recognized, and appropriated. So the entire description almost resembles an impressionistic landscape painting. The description begins with a sense of detachment. The impersonal narrative gradually builds upon a state of alienation, creating an evocative landscape in which an emotional drama involving an 11 or 12-year-old boy will be played. Yet the objectivity of the impersonal narration is deceptive, and we soon realize that the boy himself is a narrator trying to resolve his own inner psychological stories, the stories of the crisis. These stories reach almost a climactic situation through the act of narration or soliloquy, talking to oneself. So we are hearing aloud what is happening in the mind. So this mind has a voice. The first person narrator's inner voices, stated as series of soliloquies, revealed through the narration. Perhaps an adult narrator who is framing the story. When Joyce was 23, went for the publication of the story. The narration culminates into the confessional first person mode without any forewarning, achieving an effective foregrounding. Instead of giving the readers a photographic description, the narrator, through a careful selection of objects, sensations, and impressions, attempts to humanize the landscape. So I read the description from the text. North Rickmond Street, being blind, was a quiet street, except at the hour when the Christian Brothers' school set the boys free. A similar type of narration is also used in Eveline. The opening of Eveline is very interesting. So there is the voice of the omniscient narrator who is observing Evelina and describing her. So the subject focalized upon is Evelina. And what she is doing is being described through this focalization through the lens of the narrator's camera or eyes. So what is the description? She sat at the window watching the evening invade the avenue. So is it just a simple monodimensional pictorial description? Or do we find this narration kind of impressionistic, or even an image that is moving, capturing the mind of the subject? So she sat at the window is a photographic image. Watching the evening is also a part of that photographic image. That means her eyes are focalizing the evening. But the action of the evening invading the avenue, the passage of time, that is also contained in this narration. So the opening words written by Joyce communicated to the reader. The voice that we hear is the voice of that omniscient narrator. Say the voice of Joyce. Now the question is, in this narrative situation, whose voice do we hear? Whose voice does the reader hear? Is it the voice of James Joyce, the narrator, or Evelina? So if the reader is allowed to hear the narration, the writer must have made it audible through the printed text. Narratology therefore investigates these elements that project the narrator's voice. A reader can hear a textual voice with his or her mind's ear. We are also led into that specific time and space, enabling the story to be perceived, action to be perceived, along with the setting, character, even the atmosphere can be produced in our mind. So, through our mind's eye, we can also be absorbed in the atmosphere. In most of the naturalistic story, we do have the presence of the reader within the text. So, like other fictional narratives, both Araby and Eveline try to project a narrative voice. As the narrator is audible in both cases, so we can simply regard these as narrative discourses. Two seminal texts in this area. First is Gerard Genet's narrative discourse, published in 1972. The second is Seymour Chapman's Story and Discourse, published in 1978. Both these books raise the question: who speaks? Whose voice do we hear? So, obviously, the narrators of these stories are the speaking characters, persons, speaking to the narratee. So, addresser addressing to the addressee, narrator narrating the story to the narratee, as if in a real life, face to face narrative situation. So, here now I am the narrator and you are all narratee. I am the addresser, you are all the addressee. And what am I telling? I am telling the story of a story, the structure, the narrative of a narrative. So, as if in a real life, virtual, face to face interactive narrative situation, I'm saying, and you're hearing my voice. So, you can clearly identify who speaks. You will say that, yes, this person who is conducting this session is speaking. Now, if you raise some questions now during the session, I can also identify. When you are raising a question, you become the addresser, you become the narrator, interrogator, and I transform my role into the listener, addressee or narratee. But in case of fiction, in some cases, we have the problem with this identification of the narrator, especially when this narrator is involved in the narration to anonymous, invisible narratees. So we, as readers of the story, keep on wondering, who are these narrators? Say in Araby and Eveline, the opening sentences are both descriptive, written in past tense. Even the conventional SVO order, subject verb object, subject verb predicate order, syntactical order, has been maintained. Joyce perhaps thought his reader's voice enough to identify the speaker or any speech act and intentionally removed inverted commas or dashes. Thus, what we find? We find an important voice marker strategically withdrawn from the stories. So, in the first paragraphs of both Araby and Eveline, the missing voice marker keep the readers guessing. Who is narrating the story? Whose story are we listening? We know that in both the stories, we have the subject. We are listening to the story of the boy narrator, participant boy, or Eveline. No information about the narrator has been provided by the author in the first paragraph. So there is no presence of the frame narrator that we find in Joseph Conrad's work, Heart of Darkness. Conrad himself stated in his youth that this creation of Marlowe is his greatest artistic invention. By inventing this narrator, Marlowe, he has been able to distance himself, his autobiography, from the autobiography of Marlowe, allowing this Marlowe to develop as an independent, autonomous narrator, irrespective of Conrad. So, whom do we believe? The teller or the tale? So, we always keep on believing the tale rather than the teller. But when the tale does not reveal who the teller is, the tale becomes more interesting but unreliable. So, detection of the narrator becomes a part of narratological investigation. Our sense of quality and distinction of the narrator's voice is not allowed to be concretized. There is no textual elements in the opening paragraphs of the text, Araby and Eveline, that project the identity of the narrator or allow the readers to identify the narrative voice. Gradually, the voice will be culminating, resolving itself in the text, mingling or blending, fusing with the voices that are there in the text. The type of intonation used in the speech act is naturally the main area where a narratologist must investigate, because culturally appropriate speech act that is suitable for a narrator who is capable of a complex and associative thought process, get revealed through the process of narration and the intonation. In case of the anonymous, unidentifiable voice of the narrator, we do not have this clarity of intonation or tonal variations. Say in the opening paragraph of Jane Austen's novel Pride and Prejudice, the anonymous, unidentifiable voice of the narrator personifies the setting, character, introducing the story with a comment, an ironic comment. The tone of the comment is not revealed at that particular moment of the narrative time. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a man in possession of good fortune must be in want of a wife. So it is a statement. No international aspect of the sentence of the speech act is revealed. So we can easily identify that this is the voice of the omniscient narrator, and it is a truth universally acknowledged that this omniscient narrator has this omniscience and all pervasive knowledge, all inclusive knowledge, holistic knowledge about everything that is going to happen. But when this voice, this statement is contradicted by the voices that are inset, when we find soon Mrs. Bennet searching for a suitable groom for her marriageable daughters, trying to launch the daughters in the marriage market, we find the contradictions that are there ripe. The suitable boys have come to the setting, to this provincial setting, and there are also suitable girls who are waiting. And therefore, it is not a universal truth that is stated in the opening sentence, because that opening truthfulness is contradicted by the consequent statement, where we have the mother waiting for suitable grooms to dispose her daughters, forcing them to plunge into matrimony. The content matter offers an image of a restricted vision. In Araby, this becomes more problematic because this image of restricted vision, abandonment, alienation, indifference, even paralysis, all these are foregrounded in the opening paragraph by an omniscient narrator. So whose abandonment, whose alienation, whose indifference, whose paralysis do we see? When the narrator simply describes, I quote from the text, an uninhabited house of 2 stories stood at the blind end, detached from its neighbors in a square ground. The other houses of the street, conscious of decent lives within them, gazed at one another with brown, imperturbable faces. Unquote. So this interesting description by this voice that the readers hear present multiple images that are superimposed like a palimpsest. Palimpsest, you remember, is a kind of manuscript or a piece of writing material that is defaced, effaced, and then on which another writing is superimposed. Again, defaced, effaced, superimposing another writing. So multiple layers of writing. Mikhail Bakhtin talked about this multiplicity of the text, multiple layering of the text. Schleiermacher while talking about hermeneutics, also referred to this multiplicity of the text based on the sedimented layers that are there in the text. So the close reading analysis of the text refers to this identification of images that are superimposed like a palimpsest. Instead of revealing the narrator, the description offers images of something reused, altered, but still bearing visible traces of some earlier images. Say the image of North Richmond Street, image of a desecrated and abandoned church, the image of some abandoned 18th century houses, or the medieval landscape of the Holy Crusades. All these come together. So all these images in a short story cannot be fully described. And therefore, these images are superimposed and brought as a collage, as a palimpsest, as a montage. Even the subjective expression of the narrator or the expressivity markers. So subjective expressions of the narrator usually are defined through expressivity markers that indicate narrator's beliefs, convictions, ideological orientation, age, gender, or even background. These are not stated in the opening paragraph of Araby. There are, of course, some pragmatic signals or expression that signal the narrator's awareness of an audience. And there is also the degree of his or her orientation towards the object. But this is the signals is missing. The abrupt opening discards the presence of implied addressee and hides the identity of the addresser. Say, for example, in Catherine Mansfield's story, The Fly. We have in the opening line the voice of a person. You are snug in here. This is in quotation. So we are listening to the voice of Mr. Woodyfield. Said Mr. Woodyfield. So this identity of the addresser is clearly stated. The omniscient voice therefore hides behind this voice that is there. But this reveals also the boss who is snug in the space, in the office, where he stayed for 6 long years after the death of his son, changing the interiors regularly in order to keep the identity of, the memory of, the image of the boy intact. Nothing will change. The boy will remain the same. The memory of the boy will remain same. But this opening abrupt statement given by Mr. Woodyfield is contradictory towards the end of the story, where we have, through the voice of the omniscient narrator, a study of the mind of the boss. And there is simply the statement, and for the life of him, he could not remember. We understand who this he is. We know that this is the boss who says that for the life of him. We know who is this him? The son. And then we have, he could not remember. So the same boy whom, after his death, the boss has thought to preserve in the iron memorial of his mind, has faded. There's this dementia, memory loss, the absence of that image in the mind. The portrait has remained on the table for long. That face of the boy has not changed. And now we are trying to recollect that same portrait of the boy placed on the table through the mind of the boss, through the mind of the subject. So while focalizing through the mind of the subject, we find that he could not remember. Therefore, this has happened, some change has happened. And for the life of him, he could not remember. The boss cannot remember the face of the boy. In case of Evelina, we have a different type of verbal mode, the verbal mode of storytelling. The opening paragraph projects the narrative voice, but the text narrator is temporarily, spatially, ontologically separated from the readers and characters. I repeat again, the text narrator is temporally, means within the time space, separated from the space, separated, and ontologically, referring to the meaning making process, separated from both the readers and the characters. So the narrator becomes a mediator who is not in that time, in that space, in that meaning formation process. The narrator therefore belongs to a fictional, invented, imaginary, virtual, hyperreal, surreal, unreal world. Whatever this world is not a real world where this narrator belongs. Therefore, the narrator, when addressing to the readers, will always expect a willing suspension of disbelief from the readers to accept what the narrator is saying. So the narrator begins the narrative. I quote from the text, listen to it carefully, try to visualize, understand, ontologically participate in the meaning process. She sat at the window, watching the evening invade the avenue. Her head was leaned against the window curtains, and in her nostril was the odor of dusty cretonne. She was tired. So with first person singular pronoun I, this type of reflection might have been probable. Such a description. So I sat at the window watching the evening invade the avenue. My head was leaned against the window curtains, and through my nostrils I could smell the odor of dusty cretonne, and I was very terribly tired. Might have solved the problem. So this first person narrator is not there. This voice of this singular pronoun I is absent. The voice that might have, through this type of revelation, communicated to the readers, and that reflection might have been probable. So we have an inconsistent shift away from the reflector mode narration. So this can be a reflector mode narration. So you're writing your diary, you're recollecting things, you're writing poetry about yourself, and you're revealing that to the audience. My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So reflector mode narration, first person account, might have been probable, but there is an inconsistent shift away from this reflector mode narration from first person account to third person reflective narration. So thus this third person voice will say, she sat at the window watching the evening invade the avenue. Her head was, so this third person indirect form of narration is there, which of course demands a kind of first person discourse, talking to oneself, revealing to others. This abrupt opening, so we find, will have an absolutely jarring effect on the readers. So what we can do? So we can just come to this conclusion, as the subject was probably tired and she was gazing at the avenue, leaning her head against the window. This omniscient narrator must have seen through the eye of the big boss that she was just spending her time watching the evening invade the avenue. And as this setting has to be described, the evening is coming and the odor of dusty cretonne can be smelled. The focalization is on the smell, on the light, on the impressionistic details, on the tiredness. The tiredness of the evening, the end of the evening, the passing away of the day, the butts of cigarette that Eliot uses to describe the evening end, lifting of the lantern that Joyce uses to define this coming of the evening through personification. So here we have a similar type of personification of an object visible to the narrator, being personified as a subject. What is there in the reflection is revealed through a third person reflective narration. So, third person reflective narration, how many minds will this third person reflective narrator reveal in the text? So, it will have a jarring effect on the readers. So, we can say simply that probably Evelina was tired. Instead of making a straightforward declarative statement about the tiredness that she cannot reveal, the narrator is therefore revealing her state of mind. In case of Araby, when we shift to the second paragraph, the presence of the narrator is affirmed, along with distinctive voice markers through the use of personal pronouns. Personal pronouns are always voice markers. These personal pronouns can be singular. In the first paragraph, we have a plural, we, as voice marker. Therefore, the confusion is there. Here in the second paragraph of Araby, we have the use of the personal pronoun. The readers can feel the presence of somebody at least in the narrative situation, telling a story based on personal experience. An inside communicative contact is made within the author-reader communicative framework. A new set of communicators, say the narrator, an audience, or addressee, on the level of the fictional meditation is placed. The narrator's presence as characters on the level of action is also established. Now the narrator refers to our house and leads us into the back drawing room. The action of the narrator is now well defined. So there are distinctive voice markers like I found, I liked, etc. So on the intratextual level, the participants involved in the narrative communication are now established. If this passage is read out aloud, the narration follows the confessional and intimate mode. The narrator is nameless, although the narrative voice is characterized by overtness. So Seymour Chapman talks about this overtness in the narrative of Araby because of the presence of narrative voice markers. So narrators can be more or less overt, or as Chapman said, more or less covert. Both the anonymous narrators in Araby and Evelina are overt narrators. But what is the difference? The difference is that in Araby, the narrator is clearly and more overt than the narrator of Evelina. The narrator is omnipresent, audible, visible in Araby, while in Evelina, the narrator is audible but not visible. Not visible at least as a participant or a character, but loud and audible as an omniscient narrator. So this is a covert technique, according to Chapman, used in this work. A covert narrator is one who is an inconspicuous and indistinct narrator who fades into the background or goes into hiding. Hence, we can say that a narrator who wishes to stay covert will avoid talking about self, avoid a loud voice, and will also avoid any kind of pragmatic or expressivity marker. So this narrator who is going into hiding will always avoid a loud voice, will always avoid any kind of pragmatic marker of expression. The narrator's relationship to the story is projected by textual expressions, emotion, subjectivity, and pragmatics. This presence of narrator is either as a first person or a third person. So we have already talked about Genet's using homodiegetic narrative, meaning roughly the first person narrative, and heterodiegetic referring to the omniscient third person narrative. So pertaining to narrative is something that is called diegetic. So even in the Greek, the word homos, means the same, and heteros means other. So one important aspect of discourse is the difference between the narration, the act and the process of telling the story, and the narrative. What is the story that is actually recounted? A narrator may be absent from his or her own narrative, as in Evelina. This type of narrator will be called heterodiegetic narrator. Therefore, in the third person, he will be describing Evelina as using the pronoun she sat at the window. The narrative can be homodiegetic, that means can be present inside the story, inside the narrative, as in first person stories like Araby. Araby is further autodiegetic, the third type, autodiegetic, where he or she is not only inside the narrative but also figures as its principal character. So in Araby, we have the use of autodiegetic narration. In homodiegetic narrative has been used as the story is told by a narrator who is also one of the story's acting characters. In Evelina, on the other hand, the story is told by a heterodiegetic narrator who is not present as a character in the story. So this heterodiegetic narrator, in case of Evelina, is a narrator of a different nature as compared to the characters who are there in the story. But this collapses in case of Araby. In Araby, pronouns like I, me, mine, we, us, our, all these are used, as opposed to the third person, second person, he, she, him, her, they, their, etc., used in Evelina. In Araby, the word I has been used 100 times. The word me, pronoun me, has been used 18 times. While there is not a single use of these pronouns, I or me, in Evelina. As a homodiegetic text, Araby therefore contains story-related action sentences having first-person pronouns, indicating that the narrator was an active participant to the events depicted. So let us take an example from Araby. I quote, "If my uncle was seen turning the corner, we hid in the shadow until we had seen him safely housed. Or if Mango's sister came out on the doorstep to call her brother into his tea, we watched her from our shadow pier up and down the street. We waited to see whether she would remain or go in, and if she remained, we left our shadow and walked up to Mangon's sister. Mangon steps resignedly." So interestingly, we have the use of the first person pronoun, singular or plural. So first it starts with I, and soon we find we. That means a group of boys, they're waiting outside Mangon's sister, secretly spying her, watching her from our shadow, from their shadow, waiting to see whether she would come out of the house. And if she remained, so we went to Mangum's step as if enchanted by the magical spell of Mangun's sister. Evelina, on the other hand, I said, is a heterodiegetic text, as all of its story-related actions sentences are in third person. I just compare and contrast this. In Evelina, I quote from Evelina. There we have the omniscient narrator saying, "Home, she looked around the room, reviewing all his familiar objects which she had dusted once a week for so many years, wondering where on earth all the dust came from. Perhaps she would never see again those familiar objects from which she had never dreamed of being divided." So in both these narrations, we have distinctive voice markers that separate these, the first as homodiegetic narration, the second as heterodiegetic narration. In case of the second, in case of Evelina, where we have the voice of the third person narrator, there is an absence of an experiencing I. Okay, I'm using I as a pun. So I is not experiencing. The first person is not, the person who is narrating you the story is not the experiencing first person. That means the eyes are not involved in the experience. Eyes are simply like lens of camera capturing the moment. So there is an absence of this experiencing eye in the plain story related action sentences which present an event involving one or more characters in the story. Both the stories make use of many kinds of sentences, and not all of them are plain action sentence. For instance, we find descriptions, quotations, comments, etc. And these are not plain action sentences. These have been extensively used in Araby and Eveline. As these stories progress through the middle, we can easily judge whether the narrator is present or absent as an acting character in the story. So Stanzel talks about the theory of typical narrative situation. And this is very important for us to realize that the homodiegetic narrator of Araby, who is telling a story of personal experience, is there visible, audible, whereas a heterodiegetic narrator of Eveline, who is also telling a story about other people's experience, is audible but not visible. So mediation is done by this invisible narrator. In Araby, an autobiographical story about a set of past experiences narrated. The story captures the struggles of an individual through different stages of crisis and experiences that gradually and eventually shape and changed his life. Like other typical first-person narrators, the first-person narrator in this is subject to ordinary human limitations. The narrator is restricted to a personal and subjective point of view. Say if there are two characters. So first-person narrator can talk about his character or her character, not about the other character who is there. So there is this personal limitation. And the point of view becomes subjective. So there is a lack of objectivity in the act of narration. The narrator has no direct access to or authority on the events the narrator has not witnessed as a person. The narrator is not placed in two places at a time simultaneously. The narrator cannot be present if the narrator is first person, the experiencing narrator, and follows the laws of against bilocation. While the omniscient narrator can be located. In case of, say, visual narrative cinema, we find split screen. So two focalizations can go simultaneously when the screen is split into two halves. And two locations, bilocation, can be there, or even multiple location can be there. So even in this act of narration, as audience, as addressee, now you have multiple locations. So you are able to listen to the same voice sitting in different locations. But I, as narrator, do not have the access to all the locations. So if I am a first person narrator, I can narrate one at a one time. Okay, I can narrate one location, one time segment. I cannot work against this principle. So he has, in the narrative of Araby, the narrator has no way of knowing for certain what is going on in the minds of characters like priest or the uncle in Araby, or even in the mind of Mangan's sister, what is happening. He does not have an access. Although he can talk about we, the group of children, the boys, he can talk about the mind of the boys, because whatever action is there, the event, the situation, they are doing it collectively. So he can talk about them in plural we, forming a type of commune in the narratorial first person voice, even using the plural marker we. The text's relative closeness to the default condition of the narrator or participant reveals the kind of slant or attitude of the narrative voice. So looking at first person pronouns and overlooking the context in which they occur is just like walking into the notorious first person pronoun trap. So never believe the narrator, believe the story that is narrated. Never trust the teller of the tale. Trust the tale. That is what D.S. Lawrence stated once. The first person in Araby is both an acting persona and a speaking character, present in the action. And interestingly, this voice is dialectically paired as a persona, as a speaking character, dialectically paired, juxtaposed to each other. So, binary juxtaposition is there between the person who is speaking, the person who is acting. So, there is a bifurcation of the voice, experiencing eye and the speaking eye. There is a bifurcation that makes Araby a very interesting story, a very complex story. Because on the basis of this bifurcation of the speaking eye and the experiencing eye, the acting eye, we have this dialectical narration. In Eveline, the heterodiegetic narrator is not and never was a character in the world of the story. The heterodiegetic narrator has a position outside the world of the story and has unlimited knowledge and authority and assumes the power of omniscience. The narrator is inclined to speak overtly, and as Stanzel had suggested, this type of heterodiegetic overt narration is identical to authorial narrative situation. Therefore, in Eveline, we do not get any of the expressivity markers, and normally project a distinctive voice. There is no first person self-reference, no value judgment, no italicized emphasis, even no indications of a moral, no point of interest or purpose. However, the narrator seems to withdraw or hide behind the main character, Eveline, whom we encounter, whom we see. So this character is visible and her mind is audible. From the very first word of the text, she, we have this visibility of Eveline, and through this narration of the mind, so gazing at the street, through the window, sitting at the window, this Eveline's mind is also revealed to the audience. The text presents the whole subjective landscape of Eveline's consciousness. But the question is, who is narrating Eveline? Or rather, who is writing the woman? So if we take Virginia Woolf's words, that this woman is written by a man, James Joyce. The narrator is narrating this woman. The narrator is therefore speaking about this woman, writing the woman, revealing the woman, telling about her experience. Perhaps this was the only way James Joyce could have solved the question of gender and representation. The central character in a fictional narrative acts as a central consciousness. So this was Henry James. You remember William James, his brother, wrote a book on psychology, the first work on psychology that went on to influence so many writers, and especially the field of psychological studies. William James's work influenced the works of Sigmund Freud and the modern psychologists. And Virginia Woolf talked about this in her famous essay, Modern Fiction. Virginia Woolf also talked about this inability of the mind to follow a series of lampposts symmetrically arranged, chronologically arranged, and said that human mind, the mind of the narrator, author, is not a mind that is symmetrically arranged. The consciousness is like the semi-transparent luminous halo that envelopes the tale from the beginning to the end. So it is not a series of street lamps, series of gig lamps symmetrically arranged. Henry James talks about the central consciousness, the central character in a fictional narrative. According to Henry James's famous work, Portrait of the Lady. So according to Henry James, the central character in a fictional narrative acts as a central consciousness. In case of James Joyce's Eveline, the voice representing this consciousness is restricted, mediated upon, and perhaps even manipulated by Joyce. The readers, the reading experience that is created by Araby is more remarkable as the text projects a sense of directness and immediacy. The reader is drawn into the story and invited to a spatio-temporal coordinates of perception, been used to present something from the point of view of a story's internal character. However, the boy, the experiencing first person through whose eyes the action is presented, is the internal focalizer or the reflector. So, who is a focalizer? A focalizer is somebody who focuses his or her attention and perception on something. Interestingly, the adult narrator in Araby performs an identical function in the same story, in the same act of narration. The adult narrator in Araby performs an identical function. The reader's imaginative adoption of a reflector's point of view is usually called immersion or transposition to the phantasm. The readers are led to psychic immersion into alternative consciousness. And here in Araby, we have 2 points of view. What are these 2 points of view? One, 12-year-old boy's points of view. The second, the adult narrator who has already resolved whatever was happening in the mind of the boy. That adult narrator's point of view. So, if, for example, when this boy is narrating in the first person, I carried the chalice safely through a throng of foes. So he's walking, accompanying his accompanying his aunt through the streets of Dublin, carrying the parcel, market. So while carrying the parcel in a crowded street, he is imagining himself as the Arthurian knight, preserving the chalice that he has discovered, safely through a throng of foes, amid the litanies, the shrill voices of the shopkeepers, prostitutes, customers. This boy is trying to preserve the sanctity of his secret chalice. This object that he is carrying is not the chalice, we understand. But something there is in the mind of the boy, he is trying to carry safely through this world of material corruption. Through this marketplace, he is trying to carry the memory of Mangan's sister. So Araby is that magical world where this boy should go, and as per the instruction of the girl, and the boy has already promised the girl that if I go there, I shall bring something for you. So this idol of Araby looms large, and he wants to take this Arthurian journey of a knight into the fabled land, magical land of Araby, in order to bring a gift for the girl. The chalice, the Holy Grail, the quest of the Holy Grail that is involved in is the romance theme, romance motive. That has nothing to do with this materiality of carrying a parcel through the street. So the internal focalizer is a person who keeps on talking about himself. In Araby, we have 2 points of view. Now this has been resolved when the adult narrator is writing the story, recollecting the events of the past, when the boy has felt like that, when he was accompanying his aunt, thinking that this is the pure world. And finally, when the boy enters into the marketplace, he hears another voice. No, I did not say this. I did not say this. So these voices we find in Eliot's Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. So in the room, women come and go talking of Michelangelo. And what she will say? She will say, oh, how thin, how his hair is growing thin. Look at his legs. So this is not what I said. This is not at all I said. So this is the voice we are hearing through the ears of the boy who has reached the magical space of Araby in order to bring a gift for the girl, and finds that this material world only knows the worth in terms of money. So demonetization has not happened in this magical world. And this boy will have to return without anything for the girl. And soon the lights go off. There's total darkness. The magical spell is broken, and the boy is brought back to his soul self, unable to bring the fabled gift. So the chalice is lost. So this is being recognized by the adult narrator, who finds certain innocence, immaturity, unawareness in the mind of this 12-year-old boy narrator. But to the reader, what is communicated is a sense of failure. So this is not the case of Eveline. An internal focalizer who is there is a person who speaks as well as who sees. So he is not visible, the speaker is not visible, but he can speak, he can see. A heterodiegetic overt narrator foregrounds internal focalization as a figural narrator. So A for B, A is B, that is what figure of speech is, trope. So we have a figural narrator. In a figural narrative stories event, seen through the eyes of a third person internal focalizer, so we are presented the story through these eyes. The narrator presents an internal focalizer's consciousness by mimicking, so copy of a copy, mimicking the focalizer's perception. So who knows the mind of Eveline best? So we have to assume, suspending our sense of disbelief, that it is the narrator who is mimicking the focalizer's perception. Joyce usually avoids the overt narrator's intrusive presence. So even in the works of Charles Dickens was a great writer. But then we have this intrusion of the narrator again and again in the 19th century fiction. And James Joyce is deliberately becoming modernist by refusing that intrusive presence of the overt narrator in the 19th century fiction. Say, for example, in Charles Dickens's Oliver Twist, we have this boy, Oliver, being presented to the board. So they must select in the board meeting this boy, Oliver, to be a apprentice inmate of the workhouse. So the person introduces him to the board and says, I quote from Dickens, bow down to the board. This Oliver, with his limited knowledge, does not know what board is. He keeps searching, where is the board? To which board shall he bow down? He has a limited knowledge. He knows that boards are there on the dock, on the ship, made of wood. And fortunately, the narrator is writing, fortunately, Oliver saw the board. Where? The table board, made of wood. And fortunately, Oliver bowed down to the table. So this intrusive presence of this narrator in the mind of Oliver, what Oliver is thinking, where is the board, where is the board? So I do not know what board is. Of course, I should search the board. Finally, I have got a board, a wooden plank on the table. Therefore, this should be the board. Therefore, I should bow down. And the narrator says that fortunately, this Oliver bowed down to the board. So there is this tone, the satirical tone of the omniscient narrator, whose intrusive presence is felt. James Joyce is avoiding this and opening the door to an unmediated access to Eveline's mind through this prism or filter to the story events. So we can, with Stanzel, agree that there can be three possible ways, three possible or typical narrative situations. So as a narratologist, Stanzel has contributed a lot to the study of narratological structures. So three narrative situations identified by Stanzel are: number one, first person homodiegetic; number two, authorial heterodiegetic or overt narration; and number three, figural heterodiegetic, covert plus internal focalization. So I repeat. So like Gerard Ginet identified basically two types of narratives. One is heterodiegetic, one is homodiegetic. And within homodiegetic narrative, another possibility called autodiegetic narrative. So Stanzel, on the other hand, offers us three typical narrative situations. Number one, the first person homodiegetic narrator. Number two, the authorial heterodiegetic overt narrator. And number three, the figural heterodiegetic covert plus internal focalization. While most of the stories, short stories, establish their narrative situations quickly, sometimes in the very sentence, and then stick to it throughout the whole text. In narrative, in Araby, the narrative situation changes from the first paragraph to the second paragraph and emerges as a borderline case whose narrative situation vacillates between one or more types. Say the first person, homodiegetic, character, an experiencing I, a 12-year-old boy, presents the story, reconstructs the story that is retold by an adult first person narrator. They are the same persons. Okay, I understand. One is a 12-year-old boy, the other is a 23-year-old man, adult first person narrator. But the story is being reconstructed. So within this homodiegetic first person narrator, we have two voices, okay, dialectically juxtaposed. And the narrator sounds like a person, much advanced in age, who impresses on our mind. So we recapture the voices of the boy as the boy of 12-year-old boy who is narrating some glimpses of his experience, what he said, what he heard, kept in some kind of references or reference of experiencing I. But the narrator who is telling us the story, quoting these experiencing I voices, sounds like a person much advanced in age. So most probably this person is not visible. We cannot see this person. 23-year-old narrator is not visible in the text. So he is simply present in the text as a voice, telling us the story, almost resembling the heterodiegetic narrator. Finally, I must talk about Gennett's 5 central categories of narrative analysis that help us to understand the narrative structure of Joyce's stories. So Jennett, in his work called Narrative Discourse, referred to these 5 categories, 5 central categories. Number 1, order. Number 2, duration. Number 3, frequency. Number 4, mood. And finally, voice. He draws a distinction in narrative between recit. That means what actually is the order of event in the text. Okay, recit. He means the actual order of events in the text. And history, history, histoire. So Jennett French term is histoire, which is the sequence in which those events actually occurred. Okay, the chronology, that is very important. In the histoire, the chronology through which the action has happened actually, as we can infer from the text. And finally, the narration, which concerns the act of narrating itself. So I repeat, what are these 3 things identified by Jennett? One is the recit. That means the actual order of events in the text. In the text, the event might have flashback, flash forward, okay, interspersed narratives. Okay. Some kind of emissions might be there. Some kind of elaboration might be there. So whatever the order of event is there in the text, that is recit. The second is history. That means the chronologicity of the text, actually occurrence of the text with reference to time and space. And finally, number 3, the narration. How the story, how the recit, so how the histoire are narrated. So crucial elements of storytelling include, we all know, plot, characters, narrative point of view, order refers to the time order of the narrative, how it may operate by anticipation, prolepsis, anticipation, or flashback, analepsis, or anachromy. Anachromy, distortion of the chronologicity, which refers to the discordances between story and plot. So duration, the word duration signifies how the narrative may elide episodes, expand them, summarize, pause a little, and so on. Because of the brevity of the form, the story usually cannot narrate a full-length life. It can narrate a fragment or excerpt of a life. Therefore, the hints are given within that brevity of form and within the specified duration that is there in the act of storytelling. Frequency in narrative of a story, short story, involves some questions that are probably related to it regarding occurrence of the event and narration. So what is frequency? So we start raising these questions. Whether an event happened once in a story and is narrated only once, whether it has happened once but is narrated several times. If it has happened once and narrated several times, it becomes the motif. Whether that has happened several times and has been narrated several times, so this becomes the refrain. Usually in ballads we have this refrain, or happened several times but has been narrated only once as a habit or ritual. So these are the questions that are raised with relation to frequency. Frequency in narrative of a short story. So these four probable questions are answered. The category of mood comes, and this mood can be subdivided into two words: distance and perspective. While distance concerns the relation of the narration to its own material, it is a matter of recounting the story, that is called diegesis, or representing the story, that is called mimesis. And finally, the voice, the narrative voice, concerns the act of narrating itself. What kind of narrator or narrative is implied? So we always have this type of dialogism in the story. Bakhtin offers us in his discourse of the novel, Discourse. He talks about this elaborate analysis of dialogism and its relationship to the style in fictional narratives. So according to Bakhtin, between any word and its object, between any word and its speaking subject, between any word and its active respondent, there exists, I quote from Bakhtin, an elastic environment of other alien words about the same object, and this dialogically agitated and tension-filled environment of alien words, value judgments, and accents that weaves in and out of discourse in complex pattern create the novelistic discourse. In case of Araby, we have similar artistic expression where we have so many words, alien words, value judgments, accents. So when he's describing the house of the priest, so he's talking about some books that are covered, whose pages has turned yellow. So there is some kind of value judgment. When he's describing the rusty pump at the backyard, or when he's referring to the central apple tree, when he's referring to the voice of the uncle. Uncle has said that all play, no work makes Jack an idle person. He's asked him, have you read Arab's farewell to its steed? So there are intertextuality, value judgments and accents that are used, woven in and out of discourse, that too in a complex pattern. So the time of the written and the oral narrative is pseudo-time that encapsulates events and characters in the sense that they exist empirically for the reader within the defined text space. So reading involves a reconversion of the content framed in the temporal dimension into duration. Authorial speech, the speech of narrator, the inserted genres, the speech of the characters, and merely those fundamental compositional units with whose heteroglossia can enter the novel, according to Bakhtin. So there can be so many strategies involved in the act of narrating the story. Rhetorical resources are available to the writer of a story, and the writer tries consciously, unconsciously to impose the fictional world upon the readers. So narration involves a struggle against time. There is a strategic deferral of time, meaning, information to keep the suspense intact. The narrator keeps the attention of the readers fixed, and that is capable of generating suspense. Bakhtin says that authorial speech, speeches of the narrator, inserted genres, the speech of the characters, all these become part of the compositional unit through which heteroglossia can enter the novel. Hetero, multiple, gloss, reflections, visions, views can enter. Therefore, this text, like Araby or Eveline, does not become monologic. So the multiplicity of social voices and a wide variety of the links and interrelationships find place in these texts. And through this distinctive links and interrelationships between utterances and languages, voices among the speakers, we have an explicit interconnection of overt and covert narrations. So realism, as Friedrich Engels talked about, is the representation of typical characters in typical situation. Even Raymond Williams talks about the realist novel. So we can say that realist short story even obviously needs a genuine community, a community of persons linked not merely by one kind of relationship, work or friendship or family, but many interlocked kinds. So a kind of language should be there that can provide narrative based on cues in the text. And through a semiological analysis of the stories, we can understand the meaning of the story. So omission assumes even greater role because we have to fill in the gaps in between the narrative hints, omitted statements that are there, as in poem. So we have to go or visit or listen to the text again and try to fill in the gaps in between the narrative hints in order to understand or in order to complete the story. Story ends abruptly. Short stories usually end abruptly. So we have to fill in the gaps even to conclude the story according to our own perception, point of view, and we become partial author of the text. So with this, I conclude today's lecture. If you have any questions, you can ask. Any observation you want to make?